welcoming me here today. I'm really looking forward to talking about this, going through this, and then hopefully we have time. This should be 25 minutes, and then
sure,
to really engage with this on a Q&A and discussion afterward. So I'm just going to get right to it in the interest of time, because we are pushing the clock a little bit.
Yeah, we should be fine.
And while the film's fresh in our minds. So I'm going to start with the last lines of the film that were, the last lines that we hear in the film, which are, "It's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does?" A couple of people mentioned that line at the end. And of course, these are Gaff's last words. They are his words that close Blade Runner. This was not always the ending, of course, however. Okay, so what we have to keep in mind is that this is a director's restoration. I was talking about this with a few people after the film, and some of you, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but some of you might not be. And so it was not always the ending. Horrified by the plainly uncommercial quality of Scott's intended conclusion that we see here, where it just closes, the elevator doors close, and that's the end. And the ambiguity of that, so people talked about the ambiguity that's present at this point in time. Horrified by that, the producers Bud Yorkin and Jerry Perenchio overruled their director and ordered reshoots and re-edits that would radically transform the film. And that's the film version that Charles saw in 1982, right?
Sure.
And even that film still had great power, but it was a very different film from what we see here. Many of you have probably seen the result. Has anybody seen, other than Charles, the 1982 version? A few? Okay, so you've seen it. And so you might think about the contrast. What it includes is a grating voiceover narration. Harrison Ford is narrating the story as we go through, like a film noir, classic private eye film. And there's also a ridiculously incongruent ending designed to offer a sort of atmospheric and redemptive closure, something to make the audiences happy when they go home, right? And that closure, what it offers at the end of the film is Deckard and Rachel, beyond the elevator, escaping into an idyllic natural landscape. And it allows the audience to witness the sun's warm radiance for the very first time, something we never see in the film, right? So think about that ending as if you haven't seen that film, you're not familiar, or that version of the film, and contrast it with what we see here. Ridley Scott's vision would be released a decade later, around 1992. The one we see here, more or less. There were some slight changes that were made in 2007 to this version. And this version vastly enhanced the reputation of a film that, until then, had been perceived more or less as a visionary curiosity piece that ultimately failed to achieve its considerable potential. The question of Deckard's status, something that was alluded to here, I'm not sure, I think it was you, right? Whether he is human or android has been debated since the release of the director's cut, and is essential to our understanding of Blade Runner. If Deckard is revealed to be a replicant, that changes the calculus substantially. Ridley Scott said in a 2007 New York Times interview, Deckard is and always was replicant. That was the intention that the filmmakers had all the way through. That's completely changed in the early version. We would have no indication of that. Here, we see that it's ambiguous, but there's the implication. And we'll talk about why, in case anybody might have missed some of that element. But if Deckard is revealed to be a replicant in the film, the political, economic, and existential contradictions that the film explores cannot be ignored as easily. In the final scene, Deckard finds a strategically placed origami unicorn left outside his apartment by Gaff, the same character who says the final words. Of course, the unicorn was something that he had dreamed about. That is implied to be an implanted memory, and never discussed. He remembers Gaff's telling words, and in concert with the unicorn, this signals to the audience that Deckard is a replicant. Indeed, Blade Runner interrogates the question of what constitutes humanity, something a lot of people mentioned here, and it destabilizes the defined boundaries between human and replicant. This will serve as a foundational and organizational axis for my analysis. Conceptually, I will examine existentialism, mortality, and intersectional politics. Empathy, or its absence, will also be an underlying theme throughout my remarks. Specifically, I will first discuss the instrumentalization of emotion, most evidently displayed in the Voight-Kampff test machine. And this extends into an exploration of the cultural construction of memory. Then I will argue that central to all of these central to all these themes are the politics of othering, and that's another thing that a number of people refer to here. including stratification based on gender and species. I conclude by highlighting the contrasting but equally essential role of empathy in all of these processes. So indeed, Gaff's final statement, "It's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does?" forces the audience to confront that which unites us all, something else that was mentioned, how to live in the face of imminent death. In confronting this oft-denied or deferred question, but of course not resolving it, Blade Runner also encourages the audience to consider the civilizational discontents that manifest in our various attempts to repress that thought. The Los Angeles of Blade Runner is a necropolis. Images of decay pervade in every way. The people in the city are slowly dying from exposure to inescapable forms of pollution and contamination, as well as ecological devastation. Notice it's snowing at one point in Los Angeles. But it's snowing very aggressively, like not the typical kind of snow that you might get on rare occasions, right? Those with resources have departed to the off-world colonies, leaving behind the poor, downtrodden, sickly, and undesirable. There is a clear sense of white flight visible in the streets. Someone mentioned that there are very few white people that we see in the film. White flight referring to the American phenomenon that began happening in the 1960s and 1970s of people leaving the inner cities, white people leaving the inner cities and having the cities like Detroit becoming predominantly black. There are, of course, some wealthy people who remain, notably Tyrell. He, however, fortifies himself away from the populace in a massive, self-contained, green-zoned structure that serves to underscore the vast economic inequity of this dystopic future. It also offers perhaps the film's most overt symbol of death denial, the pyramid. Another signal to this effect is the euphemism applied to Deckard's job. He's not executing, but merely retiring the replicants, the rebellious replicants specifically. This context stands in stark contrast to Ronald Reagan's "It's Morning in America" campaign slogan from 1980. So Ronald Reagan, when he ran for president in 1980, it was at a time when the United States was perceived to be on the decline. It was perceived to be atrophying, falling apart. Los Angeles was certainly falling apart. Charles will tell you that in 1980, the Los Angeles of that time wasn't maybe that different in terms of the inner city streets from the way it's presented in the film. So this was something that was in the cultural zeitgeist at the time. And so Reagan's Morning in America meant that we are still young, we're still growing, we're not dying. So this campaign slogan was fresh in the minds of audiences in 1982. It in itself this slogan, a firm if delusional denial of societal atrophy and decay, and arguably death itself. Now to begin to analyze the instrumentalization of emotion, something I think is really central to the film, I'd first like to discuss Sartre from the Judith Barrett reading. Some people get a chance to read the Judith Barrett reading. And the limits of authenticity assessment. Judith Barrett's piece, Blade Runner and Sartre, was written with the original version in mind. That's something that we have to also consider, the 1982 version. It doesn't quite cohere with this entirely. Although she effectively challenges Sartre's notion of authentic human experience in her analysis of Roy Batty's Redemption, the literal demarcation separating human from android continues to remain very much intact in her writing. An obstacle she attempts to resolve by applying the notion of programming, metaphoric programming that is, of the human condition, i.e. we are all programmed by our social influences. She says that at the end of the piece. Sartre emphasizes the need to embrace the authenticity of human experience, which revolves around our capacity to feel, affect. The world of Blade Runner is largely devoid of genuine affect. Relations that we see are purely commodified and exist according to the logic of exchange. Life is consequently inauthentic in Sartrean terms, and consequently Barrett argues that Sartre would approve, in a sense, of the void-comp test because it measures emotion. I find this contention to be, considering Sartre's distrust of science, I find this to be dubious, but let's go forward with it and see. She does, however, she modifies this a little bit, or she qualifies it by saying that that he would, instead of a machine that measures empathy, he would prefer a measure of despair, forlornness, which is essential to the authentic condition. Now, the reason for that, of course, is that Sartre says that we need to deal with the fact that of a non-existent God, a God that doesn't exist. That's why we need forlornness, we need despair. So this is also essential to Sartre's attempt to confront death without repressing it, as denial would be inauthentic. However, he points to point to the Voigt-Kampff test in the film. The way it's presented in the film, its function is not to measure authenticity in the Sartrean sense of the word of existence. That would be qualitative. The Voigt-Kampff would fail if this was its measure, as the humans appear to be apathetic and deadened, while the replicants seem vitally alive. The real goal, of course, is to functionally distinguish replicant from human on a mechanistic, quantitative level, in a way similar to the Alan Turing test that is referenced in the piece. In other words, Blade Runners are testing more for facticity in the sense that the past defines who one is, as past events are immutable or unchangeable. The past is the distinguishing deficit of the replicant. That is their deficit. They just simply do not have a past to draw from. As Barad argues, they lack experience and maturity. Consequently, Voigt-Kampff does not distinguish replicants from humans, but merely the lack of a past, absence of facticity in the subject. Replicants can't pass the test because they simply have insufficient memories from which to draw from. Paradoxically, they can pass as humans in everyday life, hence the need for a test. Importantly, Deckard alludes to the potential unreliability of the test before he even encounters Rachel, indicating that the Voigt-Kampff is already becoming outmoded. A crisis of distinction looms. The film suggests that the problem with Voigt-Kampff is that it is unable to truly measure empathy, only the reflexes associated with it. It attempts to categorize and quantify the response time based on the presumption of a universal subject, that everybody would respond in the exact same way. Now, IQ and polygraph tests reveal the flaws in this logic of quantification due to cultural variation, for example, and also based on exceptionalities like autism and other kinds of conditions like that, where our responses would be completely different to various questions. We see a similar cultural variation at work with the replicants' inability to pass the Voigt-Kampff. They do demonstrate high levels of empathy, but do not physically respond properly to these abstract, decontextualized questions. They don't conform to the dominant example of the universal subject, so they are consigned to the subhuman category and they're promptly executed. Thus, Voigt-Kampff can also be seen as an instrument of oppression. I would argue that this nuanced depiction of technological dependency and the inevitable systematic failure is part of Blade Runner's broader critique of the structural limits of instrumental rationality, the sense that everything has an instrumental purpose, that we use it, we exploit it, and then we discard it. The logic of instrumentalization is the guiding influence, of course, of capitalism and its descendant, neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was on the ascent in the early 1980s, most visibly thanks to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Aside from exploitation, expropriation, and extraction, neoliberalism is also characterized by victimization. There must be winners and losers in the marketplace. It is, of course, a perverse irony that the losers here are the earthbound people in this film, except for people like Tyrell. And that success is revealed in departure from Earth. That is a fundamental irony. But it's actually very consistent with the notions of instrumental rationality, and we'll get in a little deeper into that. Instrumentalist thought establishes a binary between the immanent realm and the transcendent realm. We'll talk a little bit about transcendent. That transcendent in this case is anything that's man-made. It's technology, the market. Blade Runner offers a literal transcendence in the fact that the successful people abandon the nature of Earth entirely. So the idea of instrumental rationality is mastery over objects. Some people were talking about the objectification, the subjectivization of the replicants. So the primary premise here is that you have complete control over nature. You master it. You treat nature, animals, or anything that falls into the objectified status, women, racialized other, whatever the case is, as being something that you control. And at the end of the day, Earth becomes disposable. People leave. Blade Runner presents the limits of instrumental rationality. The transcendent has actually consumed the immanent. The technological has consumed the natural in this case. And we see it's very evident in the film, the pollution that is caused by all of the industrial environmental degradation has made it so that it's completely uninhabitable. Thus, new sites, if it's going to be destroyed, new sites of immanence must be colonized. They must be created and then colonized. The Voigt-Kampff test is another example of transcendence mastering immanence, of technology trying to master nature. Yet it's very difficult to measure all expressions. It cannot measure all expressions of empathy because it is an artifact of instrumental rationality. And instrumental rationality is itself devoid of empathy. So that's another one of these fundamental contradictions. Some critics have pointed to this audit that we see, that the test that's done with Voigt-Kampff, that it resembles, some critics have pointed out, a tax audit. And certainly the word empathy isn't the first thought that comes to mind when we think of tax auditors, but it has that kind of dimension to it. However, I think there's something else at work here, implicit in the German name for the test, Voigt-Kampff. Voigt-Kampff is a descendant of the pseudoscience assessments and other attempts by the Nazis to separate Jews from the rest of the population, to define who fits into the proper definition of human and who is subhuman. Voigt-Kampff then is an alibi. It's an excuse. It sanctions the murders of the replicants by designating them as illegitimate other. Replicants are clearly alterized, which means they're othered, they're put into another, they're considered to be something different from the mainstream, but they're not even obviously considered human. And they're put into this realm of what Judith Kerman, a critic who wrote on Blade Runner, calls the metahuman. And therefore, they are fair game to be oppressed, enslaved, and finally killed. In the absence of immanence, nature, instrumentalists must genetically engineer it. In this way, replicants have been assigned to the immanent space inhabited by nature, which includes animals, but also, as mentioned, in the human realm, women and racialized others, of which the best example of this would be the 19th century's enslavement of African Americans, a point I will return to soon. The irony is so rich here. Synthetic beings produced to be, quote, more human than human, as Tyrrell says, consigned to the immanent space and whose segregation is validated by an empathy test designed by hegemonic interests that have no real use for empathy. Emotion is bound up with processes like memory and the resurrection of the past. And that's a theme that we see throughout the film and something that I'm going to unpack a little further here. So, allow me to return to the notion of facticity and the replicant's memory deficit. Marlene Barr, and you guys might take, if you're interested, you can take a look at this essay on speciesism and sexism. I gave it to whom and I was busy preparing some other things and this last night, and so I think you have it. You can email it to everybody if people are interested in this topic. So Marlene Barr refers to the film's obsession with photography and other forms of visual recording. An example is the Esper device that Deckard has that allows him to be able to not only zero in to the micro detail, but also he can actually see various angles. The video documenting Leon's assaults on Condon, that's played throughout, right? We see that over and over again. So she references this. The replicants. I almost did that before, too. The replicants hold on to photos to remind them of their past experiences, she points out. The examples are the photos that Jorah leaves behind in her apartment, Leon's photo of Jorah, and the most important one is Rachel's photos of her non-existent childhood. Barr concedes that in the case of Deckard and Rachel, their memories are manufactured. But she argues that this makes them no less sentient than us, because human memories are largely manufactured as well. Now, she doesn't mean literally, of course, but metaphorically. Now, according to this logic, we could paraphrase Gaff's statement. Gaff's statement of, it's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does? Well, according to this logic, we could change that to, it's too bad her memories aren't real, but then again, whose are? Barr makes a compelling argument here that would seem to channel Baudrillard's contention that simulation is becoming indistinguishable or inseparable from reality. Film actors like Harrison Ford are the real replicants who fabricate their emotional responses for our consumption in films, and they provide us with manufactured memories of our own that are even better than the real thing. so to speak. Now, the idea that we have these memories from films, Charles was talking about how powerful the Blade Runner experience was when he first saw it, and that it lingers and it becomes actually more prominent than many of our own memories as a result. So that's what she's talking about. Pointing to the example of Sebastian, and Sebastian was the guy in his, I'm not the best with names of characters, so Sebastian is the guy with you know, with the dolls, and he was aging rapidly, right? So pointing to his example, Barr contends we also have manufactured friends just like him. They are our imagined interaction with replicant stars, like Harrison Ford, who haunt the collective imaginary. And she also has this great line where she says that the actors who are playing the replicants are replicants of replicants, in that sense, right? So it's like this meta level going on in the film from her point of view. This convergence of photos and friends, well, I think it inevitably brings us to the phenomenon of Facebook. This would be the ultimate extension of Barr's assertion, something she, of course, couldn't see in 1991, right? Similar to Rachel's photographic appeal to Deckard, when she says, here, look, this is me, this is my past, right? I exist. Similar to that, today the Facebook obsession with photo posting would seem to reflect our own collective anxiety that we really do matter, and perhaps a necessary reminder that we actually exist. A record of our facticity, as it were. That's the simulacra of Facebook. The ultimate manifestation of Barr's notion of memory manufacture, like I said, I think it would be that simulated form of Facebook. Okay, so I'm going to move on. We're just a few more to go here. The institutional evil. This is the focus I'm going to look at here. Institutional evil and the limits of Sartrean existentialism. Barad argues that Sartre would hold Deckard accountable to the decisions he is making to kill replicants on the logic, what if everyone else did exactly as he did? Sartre's ontology, however, I think is insufficient and decontextualized. It's a decontextualized response to institutionalized evil as presented in the film. Instrumental rationality and its inheritor, neoliberalism, functions on a logic that everyone is or should be operating exactly as Deckard is. Eat or be eaten. That's the logic that dominates here. Or as Bryant warns, his boss, Bryant, tells him when he's trying to get him to come back into the game, he says it's either be a cop, Deckard, or belittle people. When the system sanctions killing, then it's not really perceived as killing. On this level, I believe the phenomenological existentialists hold more water on this topic. Hannah Arendt's emphasis on the banality of evil. Is people familiar with Hannah Arendt's notion of that? Okay, so I don't have to explain that, but I think that applies more here, is more compatible with the rhythms of the the impersonal, hierarchical landscape of Blade Runner, and increasingly for our own neoliberal context. However, Sartre's assertion that despair must haunt the human imaginary is actually quite fittingly represented in the landscape of Blade Runner, but just not in the way that Barad claims. The replicants are the only ones who grieve or indicate a melancholic outlook. They are living authentically, even though they lack the facticity that would designate their humanity, while the humans appear to be the robotic drones. As Julia Kristeva argues in Black Sun, quote, without a bent for melancholia, there is no psyche, only a transition to action, unquote. It is such a soulless transition to action that characterizes the corporatocracy of Blade Runner's Los Angeles. In such a corporatized landscape, there is no room for authentic being, only the instrumentalization of being. In Blade Runner, people are reified. That is to say, they're reduced to things, living out precarious economic existences, while replicants attempt to transcend their commodified status in a futile quest to find significance for their lives. Like Camus' example of Sisyphus pushing the rock up the mountain only to have it drop down the other side, Roy Batty's memories will be lost, as he says, like tears in the rain. My final segment here is I want to get into Deckard, ghosts in the machine. And a number of people brought that up. It's very important in this film. Another element to consider is that element. So indeed, Deckard weighs heavily in the film. Somebody mentioned Pris's line, right, quoting Deckard. And she justifies her existence to Sebastian on these Cartesian terms. The film constitutes a clear challenge to Descartes' mind-body dualism, however. There I almost did it again. The replicants can think. Now, and it's very ironic, because I don't think the replicants would vote Republican if they could. But anyway, So the film parodies this logic in different ways. Firstly, we see a convergence between body and mind in the homonym I, right? So the I that Descartes is talking about, but then the I that we see with. Eyes, these ones, of course, occupy a place of prominence in the film. The film begins with that amazing shot, that hypnotic shot of Roy's eye juxtaposed with the nightmarish LA landscape. As Marlene Barr points out, Roy is searching for the I, the internal I, who created his own I, both this one and himself. Chu, who is the subcontractor who works inside that really cold facility, right? Chu is the designer of the Nexus 6 eyes, but as an alienated, atomized subcontractor, he is blind to the other elements of the project and is unable to help Roy. Tyrell is presented as a technocratic Silicon Valley visionary who embodies the new ruling class. His vision is purely instrumental and is utterly blind to the humanistic consequences of his Promethean pursuits. He is incapable of reflection and therefore incapable of true vision. His protrusive glasses are about this thick. They symbolize the blindness of that kind. When Roy finally confronts him, Tyrell, he seems to recognize this deficiency in his creator and obliterates Tyrell's eye, his existence, his very being, by penetrating his eyes. It's a fittingly Oedipal response, albeit it's a doubly inverted one, blinding his father before he kills him. In this variation, it is the father who fails to see and must be doubly punished. Such a death defiantly underscores the mind's reliance on the body. The notion of the mind's independence from the body is rendered absurd and demolished by such imagery. Tellingly, this seems to be the preferred method of killing for the replicants. I'm going to try to stop doing that, as Leon attempts to make Deckard pay in the same way. Judith Kerman points out that the eyes also represent surveillance, power, and oppression. Consequently, Deckard's, the way his vision, she argues, that seeing leads to the destruction of the powerless in the film. So Deckard's ability to watch with the Esper device, the videos that he's watching, and being high above in those really cool sky cars that they have when he's able to look down and see the street below. So Deckard's manipulation of that also, as I said, reflects this motif of the surveilling power of the eye. Deckard's name is also intended to be a corruption of Descartes, inherited from Dick's novel. So think Deckard, Descartes, and that's something that Philip K. Dick intended. The fact that Deckard himself is an android once again challenges Cartesian logic, particularly Descartes' conception of animals as machinae animae, animated machines. In Philip Dick's novel, animals are crucial because of their rarity. They are the victims, of course, of instrumental rationality. They've been hunted into extinction, or their ecosystems have been so depleted that most of them have died off. In the logic of the marketplace, this only serves to make them all the more valuable as expensive status symbols. This is in the book, not the film, but it's implied in the film. There's the talk about whether certain animals like Jorah's snake is real or not. It is Cartesian logic in part that justifies this sort of holocaust of animals. If they are only animated machines, as he claimed, they have no authentic existence. So we are justified in exploiting and killing them as we see fit. With animals exhausted, replicants take their place. They are literal machinae animae, and yet they're more human than human. A society that has long since eradicated reflection has no use for examining such contradictions. The replicants are reduced to the status of what Barr calls metahuman other, and will either serve or be destroyed by their human overlords. And actually, I lied. The last part I'm going to focus on is speciesism and sexism. So Marlene Barr draws the conclusion that Blade Runner is in many ways a meditation on speciesism. Concisely, speciesism is discrimination and devaluation based on species membership. This generally manifests in harm to non-humans. She argues that in the absence of animals, institutionalized cruelty is then applied to the metahumans. They take the place they substitute the missing animals. The replicant animal convergence arises numerous times in the film. So even though it's much more central in the book, it's very clearly, it resonates here in the film as well. For example, they're of course prey to be hunted by Deckard. They are objectified. Notice that when Deckard first refers to Rachel as she, when he finds out that she is an android, he immediately switches to it. Deckard is referred to as a walking slaughterhouse. There's also Roy's animalization at the end, where he begins to howl. When Roy Batty smashes his head through the wall, he almost appears as a grotesque parody of the animal's head as the hunter's prize that's mounted on the wall. Instrumental rationality reduces nature, animals, and vulnerable people all together. It's all a kind of interrelated oppression to objects of manipulation. Barr discusses the convergence between speciesism and sexism, and how the sexual exploitation of women, like the exploitation of animals, is based on this objectification of the other. This is prominently reflected in the film. Once again, for example, Pris is a pleasure model assigned to service the sexual needs of men, I think specifically soldiers in the off-world colonies. She's a slave, not a prostitute. If she refuses to submit to her job or what she must do, then she will die. Rachel says to Deckard, "I'm not in the business, I am the business." Jor's job is as a stripper, and her death scene running through the plate glass windows that house provocatively posed mannequins that are presented in a kind of sexual way, all underscore this theme. And that's something hopefully we get into, is the sexism. How we can, is this something that the filmmakers are consciously presenting, or is this something that is coming across in a sexist way? The objectification of women and animals are interdependent and stem from the same Cartesian logic that reduces animals into non-feeling machines. Once that Rubicon has been crossed, vulnerable others of all kinds may be objectified and assigned to sub- or metahuman status. Cannibalistic culture and the redemptive potential of radical empathy. This is truly actually the last thing. I keep losing track of it, but it's 2 more pages. There we go. So this is the last one. Blade Runner also. So we're going to look at cannibalistic culture and the redemptive potential of radical empathy. So Blade Runner presents a society that is metaphorically consuming itself in the same way that it literally consumed nature. Michael Ryan and Douglas Kellner point out Tyrell's pyramid also suggests a kind of Mayan sacrifice. Life on Earth is being sacrificed to the gods of technology and its guiding scripture of instrumental rationality. The Mayan reference also signals a culture that is on the verge of collapse. Soon there will be no sacrificial subjects left to consume. They'll all be used up. In such ways, Blade Runner then presents us with the inevitable extension of neoliberal and instrumental thinking. There is no sense of community or solidarity to be seen at all in the film. All the characters, as well as the masses who populate the crowds, are fragmented, each relentlessly pursuing their own rational self-interest, as Adam Smith and Stephen Harper would probably put it as well. Judith Kerman points to the fact that the advertisements of the off-world colonies are indistinguishable in tone and delivery method from the Coca-Cola ads. So the government ads, you can't tell them apart. And the government ads would be, as I said, those off-world advertisements for people to leave Earth. So these are indistinguishable. In fact, she argues that the, quote, only government we see consists of cops, advertising, and garbage trucks. By advertising, she, as I said, I already said that, she means the off-world colonies. None of this, she says, in the age of Reagan would seem improbable, this focus on government being reduced to those 3 things. Indeed, the social atomization would seem to also reflect Margaret Thatcher's famous adage, there is no such thing as society, only individual men, women, and families. Also prescient is the way in which the police serve as a Blackwater-esque paramilitary. Their function indeed seems to be to protect and serve, but just not the interest of the populace, but rather those of corporations, so as to literally clean up their mess. Kerman asserts that in this way, quote, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Homicide Squad have merged in the replicants, but also that government and the corporations have become indistinguishable, unquote. Almost there. As a vision of corporatocracy run amok, Blade Runner provides a forceful visualization of Freud's notion of the return of the repressed. Death, i.e. the extinction of nature, animals, replicants, is denied only so that its specter can dominate the mise-en-scène of Ridley Scott's world. The hellish vision of the entrancing Hades landscape that we see at the beginning of the film, of the nightmare world, the hell of Los Angeles, crystallizes the death culture that pervades the society. It is highly significant that it is Roy Batty's eye that surveys humanity's ultimate perversion, the manufacture of death. Roy and the other replicants are manufactured death, in that they are potentially lethal machines, and yet they have been assigned predetermined expiration dates. But in this way, Roy, with his accelerated lifespan, is granted the ultimate opportunity to become more human than human. In the Heideggerian sense, that freedom, quote, freedom, human freedom, is earned by properly concentrating on death. Roy's attention is attuned in a way that only the terminally ill could understand. For Heidegger, it is mortality that forces the living to take life seriously. Heidegger would also argue that Batty's revolution against his oppressor grants him an authenticity, freeing him from the programming and allowing him to search for the true meaning of his existence. Anthony Pate argues that Batty falls short of full transcendence, saying that confronting, in his words, his makers becomes, in confronting his makers, I should say Roy Batty confronting his makers becomes part of the quest, but killing them marks his failure to transcend his own nature. He can't transcend his programmed nature because he kills them. I disagree, however. Although Batty kills his makers, he reserves what Marc Lussier calls a radical empathy for Deckard, the man who has just brutally once again retired Batty's lover, Pris. So he's able to show empathy to the man who killed his lover. The radical empathy Batty reserves for Deckard reflects what Claire Jean Kim calls multi-optic vision, another way of thinking about intersectionality and interconnectedness. Batty emphatically spares Deckard, Batty empathetically spares Deckard, but also forces Deckard to empathize with the oppressed experience of the objectified other. Now you know what it is to live in fear. That's what it is to be a slave, he says to Deckard. The ending reveals Deckard has received this lesson and has learned to empathize as he returns to Rachel, but now on equal terms. But Batty's lesson of radical empathy is not only assigned to Deckard,